One of the biggest mistakes people commonly make is what is defined as a remake. A lot of films released are classified as remakes when they're actually not, and in doing so loses sight of what the filmmaker's intention is. To set the record straight, I'm going to explain in detail what is a remake and what is an adaptation. Let's start with a simple definition. By definition, a remake is when a movie redoes another movie, one not based on any pre-existing source material, and tells the same story, using the same basic arc and characters and so forth. A film adaptation is the process in which a director and screenwriter take a different piece of media, most notably a book or a play, and turns it into a movie. Where the confusion sets in for some people is when a particular work is adapted for the screen more than once. Let's look at one of the most often told stories in filmdom, Dracula. The first known film adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel is Nosferatu, which basically used the book as its source and changed the names around because they thought Stoker's family would not notice. In 1931, Todd Browning famously directed a film adaptation of Dracula, which was based on the book, and a popular stage play at the time. Since then, there was the Hammer Films production with Christopher Lee, Francis Ford Coppola's take on the material in the 90s, Werner Herzog's Nosferatu, the recently released Dracula Untold, and countless others. None of those are remakes of Nosferatu or the 31 Dracula, but rather new adaptations of Bram Stoker's original book. The same rules apply to a film based on a play. Death of a Salesman has been brought to the screen on a number of occasions, but those are all adaptations of Arthur Miller's original play. The multiple film versions that exist are not remakes of the 1951 film starring Frederick March, they are simply new adaptations of the source material. Annie is another notable example of a stage play that has been made into more than one movie, none being remakes of previous incarnations. The 1999 TV movie, directed by Rob Marshall, used the stage musical as the source material, using some of the songs removed from the 1982 film, not using any of the new songs written for the earlier film, and even reinstating plot points from the play. The new Annie, opening in December, is similarly not a remake. It again uses the stage show as its main source, while also transporting it to present day and updating the songs to a more modern style. You would think that would stop people from calling it a remake, but alas. What about the recent trend of turning movies into stage musicals, which are then turned into films? Well, to use one example, Little Shop of Horrors was originally a movie directed by Roger Corman in 1960. Howard Ashman and Alan Menken then took that movie and made a stage musical out of it. Frank Oz subsequently directed a film version of Little Shop of Horrors, which adapted the stage show. It was not a remake of the Corman film, as it did not use that as the source. Same rules apply to Hairspray, The Producers, Nine, Sweet Charity, and other cases where this sort of thing happened. You also have the interesting cases of Les Miserables and The Phantom of the Opera. Those have been turned into many movies over the years, all of which were based on the original books. The recent musical movies of those stories were based on the stage shows rather than going to the original books as their main inspirations. Though if you thought those were confusing, you should see the progression of the movie musical Chicago to the screen. Originally a series of newspaper columns on some infamous murderesses, those articles were then adapted into a play called Chicago, which was adapted into a silent film in the 1920s. That play was again adapted into a movie called Roxy Hart, starring Ginger Rogers. Bob Fosse took the play and made it into a stage musical, which was ultimately adapted into the hit Oscar-winning movie, starring Renee Zellweger. But 2002 Chicago and Roxy Hart are not remakes of 1927 Chicago. Rob Marshall's Chicago was based on Bob Fosse's Chicago, while Roxy Hart and Frank Urson's Chicago were based on Maureen Dallas Watkins' Chicago. It's complicated, but I tried to explain that as simply as I could. However, what about when a movie is based on a television series? Considering television shows are a different medium than film, it's still an adaptation. For lack of a better example, when M. Night Shyamalan decided to make a live-action film based on the first season of Avatar: The Last Airbender, the process which he took in writing a screenplay was actually not that different from when he wrote his vastly superior adaptation of Stuart Little. He had to take the story told on television and then make the changes and adjustments to make it work as a 90-minute movie. I don't think he succeeded, but it was still a complicated process that required him to take those 20 episodes, or chapters, and adapt them into a feature film. Strangely enough, Two types of movies avoid this mistake of being labeled remakes. People seem to accept, even when there's multiple animated films based on the same story, that it's a new adaptation of the material. So everybody saw Disney's The Hunchback of Notre Dame as an adaptation of the Victor Hugo book, rather than a remake of the silent film or the version with Charles Laughton. Comic book movies, even those bringing back previous screen heroes, also avoided the remake mark. Nobody called Man of Steel a remake of Richard Donner's Superman. The public mostly see these as new interpretations of the comic book, or reboots, which is an acceptable term. Now, are there exceptions to the rule? Yes, there are, actually. If the filmmaker decides to use the earlier film as a source rather than the original book or play, then it can be classified as a remake. Robert Bloch wrote the book Psycho, which Alfred Hitchcock then adapted into a movie. When Gus Van Sant chose to make his own version of Psycho, rather than going back to the original novel, he only used the Hitchcock film's inspiration, to the point of it being almost shot for shot, and even using the exact same screenplay with minor changes here and there. When Hollywood sees a successful foreign film and decides to make an English language version, if it's based on the book, they will use the film as a source anyway. So you have Matt Reeves and Gore Verbinski making English language remakes of Let the Right One In and The Ring respectively, rather than using the original book as a source material, to the point where the two movies even have similar looking shots. When a short film is made into a full-length movie, that also counts as a remake, since the director is taking one film and redoing it into another movie. If that short was based on a book, then it's a film adaptation, unless that short serves the only inspiration for the film. To make sense of the whole thing, let's use a hypothetical example. What if Warner Brothers decide to make a new film version of The Wizard of Oz? If it contained none of the songs from the 1939 film, had a child actor play Dorothy, used silver slippers, included a visit to Chinatown, portrayed the witch as a short, eye-patched old woman, had the characters wearing special spectacles in the Emerald City, and other such elements from the book that weren't used in the famous MGM movie, then it would be an adaptation of the book. If it used the songs from the musical, had a teenager play Dorothy, used ruby slippers, made the Wicked Witch green, made the character designs and costumes similar to the movie, and had characters from Kansas reappear as citizens of Oz, then sure, called a remake, since it appears the main inspiration would be the 1939 film. And to conclude, I'm going to look over the career of a filmmaker often seen as somebody who does a lot of remakes, but he actually hasn't. None other than Tim Burton. Pee-wee's Big Adventure was based on the stage play, Beetlejuice was an original idea, Batman and Batman Returns were based on comic books, Edward Scissorhands was an original idea, Ed Wood was based on a biography, Mars Attacks was based on trading cards, Sleepy Hollow was based on a short story, Planet of the Apes is an adaptation of the book, not a remake of the 1968 movie as incorrectly thought, and that includes the confusing ending. Big Fish was based on a book, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was based on the book, not a remake of the 1971 movie, to the point where the screenwriter didn't even watch the earlier film. Corpse Bride was based on a folktale, Sweeney Todd was based on a stage musical, Alice in Wonderland was a sequel to the book, Dark Shadows was based on a television series, and Frankenweenie was a remake. His only remake. So I hope that clears things up about what's a remake and what's an adaptation, and that answers some questions you may have had on the subject. See you next time.